Today, Manhattan prosecutors filed paperwork arguing President-elect Trump's hush money conviction should stand, saying that his position as president-elect does not grant him legal protection. And over in the Supreme Court, justices heard arguments on one of the nation's bedrock environmental laws. The case, 7 County Infrastructure Coalition versus Eagle County, Colorado, deals with the National Environmental Policy Act. Currently, agencies must review the potential impacts of approved major infrastructure projects under the act, something the oil industry is hoping to limit in the future. Joining us now with more insight on the case is the Hill's courts and legal reporter, Zach Schonfeld. Zach, let's start off with the court filing in New York today by prosecutors with New York District Attorney Alvin Bragg's office. They argue the criminal case should not be dismissed because he's president. What do we know about the filing and what happens next?
Hey, Drew, what happens next is the judge here is going to have to decide what should happen now that Donald Trump is president-elect. This is the final brief in these arguments, so we expect that the very next thing will be that ruling. Trump has argued that everything here has to go. He says that jury's verdict from the spring finding him guilty of 34 felonies, that has to be wiped. The indictment has to be tossed. This whole case must end. This new filing that we got today from prosecutors is staking out opposition to that. They're acknowledging that, yes, Trump is about to be president again, and there's going to need to be some accommodation, but they told the judge that he has several alternatives here, like merely halting the case while Trump is in office. But the bottom line of their filing is saying that whatever remedy needs to happen here, that the case should not be dismissed entirely.
Meantime, the alleged gunman in the death of UnitedHealthcare CEO Brian Thompson is in court this afternoon. Zach, walk us through what we know about Luigi Mangione and the latest developments you're hearing from Pennsylvania.
Yeah, there's been a lot of developments here in the past 36 hours or so since he was arrested on Monday morning at a McDonald's in Pennsylvania. He is now facing 2 different sets of charges. He was originally brought in Pennsylvania on firearms charges and showing a fake ID. But this morning we learned that he is now also facing a murder charge back in New York. So he is now finally actually being charged directly over the killing of the UnitedHealthcare CEO. So he's back in court this afternoon on the request of New York to extradite him from Pennsylvania into New York. So that proceeding should be happening quite literally as you and I speak here right now about whether the defendant here is going to oppose that effort. But at some point, New York is pushing to get him back in Manhattan and to take him to trial on this murder charge.
Zach, on that environmental case before the Supreme Court, this is one of a number of environmental disputes justices have taken up in recent years. What's at stake?
Yeah, so this results from a proposal to build a nearly 90-mile railway in Utah. It would connect a region of Utah to the national rail network, would be used to transport crude oil. The issue in this case is when the federal government approved this project, whether their environmental review was stringent enough to comply with federal requirements. So this case is being closely watched by environmental and regulatory interests here, not only for the future of this railroad in Utah, but also because the decision here is going to stand to impact the various construction proposals that are approved by various federal agencies and exactly what environmental effects they have to study before approving these types of projects. So a big regulatory case that we expect a decision in by next summer.
And this week, justices also declined to wade into several hot-button topics. What cases did they refuse to decide?
Yeah, this was the latest batch. Each week in which the Supreme Court is in session, they take up a batch of petitions to take up cases. There are thousands of these that come in each year. About 99% of those are declined, and the vast majority of those are declined without any comment. But what was notable this week is that in several of the cases that were denied, we got written statements and dissents from several of the conservative justices. So I'll just take one case to highlight. This was a case that was challenging a temporary admissions policy in Boston used to admit students to the city's prestigious exam schools. This was a follow-up to that affirmative action case at the Supreme Court last year that effectively gutted race-conscious admissions policies in higher education. This policy was a little bit different. On its face, it wasn't considering race. Instead, the way this admissions policy worked is they admitted students with the top GPAs from each zip code in Boston got admitted to the schools. And so this was a challenge by a group of white and Asian parents claiming that their students had been discriminated against. So the Supreme Court declined to take up their challenge, but we did get written dissents from Justices Thomas and Alito saying they would have heard the case.
The Supreme Court also declined to lift Trump's gag order. What did they rule on that?
Yeah, I wouldn't read too much into this one. This was an emergency application that was filed by a pro-Trump YouTuber. He said he was trying to get comment on the judge in New York, his daughter, who is covered by the terms of this gag order. So Trump could not comment to him about the judge's daughter. So he took an appeal all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, not on their normal docket, on their emergency docket, seeking an intervention. And I read this order. They didn't give any explanation, but I read this as nothing more than the Supreme Court merely just trying to get rid of this case. They didn't seem to take this very seriously.
All right, that's all I got. Thank you, Zach Schonfeld.
Thanks, Drew.
This week, a federal court in North Dakota blocked Affordable Care Act coverage for a group of immigrants known as Dreamers. The ruling blocks a Biden administration effort finalized in May of this year that aimed to close the gap in health care coverage for the group. Dreamers are undocumented immigrants who were illegally brought into the U.S. by their parents. As a result of the ruling, they will no longer have access to the Affordable Care Act marketplace. Joining us now is the Hill staff writer, Rafael Bernal. Rafael, thanks for joining us. This ruling is a setback to health care coverage for hundreds of thousands of Dreamers. What impact will it have on the ground?
Well, it's only limited to a handful of states, maybe I think about a couple dozen tops. And these people won't be able to get into the ACA. It'll make it more expensive for them to get health care. All of the all of the ACA benefits, these Dreamers, these DACA holders will not have that. And it's really part of a more global attack on DACA that's happened since day one, since 2012, when President Obama implemented DACA, sort of trying to chip away at it from a lot of angles on the Republican side and trying to add protections to it on the Democratic side. And the program is getting smaller and smaller just by virtue of attrition. So eventually these lawsuits will be moot, and Congress will most likely not have acted to resolve the broader issue.
Pressure is being put on President Biden in the waning days of his administration to take action to protect immigrants and migrants. A group of Senate Democrats wrote a letter with some asks in these final days. What do they want, and there's any indication that the Biden administration is planning on that?
So this group of Democrats, led by Senator Padilla from California, Cortez Master from Nevada, and New Mexico's Ben Ray Lujan, they want basically any permit that the Biden administration, that the administration gives to undocumented or documented immigrants, whether it's work permits, whether it's extending TPS, temporary protected status, just re-extend it right before you leave, basically. If you can give people a 18-month runway on TPS, give them those 18 months before the Trump administration can act against them, sort of in the assurance that the Trump administration will act to end all of these programs. The Biden administration has not committed to doing that. They've made a few smaller rule changes. For instance, today there was an announcement that EADs, employment authorization documents, will be extended to a 540-day validity period instead of 180 days. So people who already have this work permit will be able to work, for longer.
You've been covering the possibility of a upcoming trade war between the U.S. and Mexico and Canada. Trump trolled Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada on Truth Social, calling him the governor of the state of Canada. Trudeau is facing election next year, unpopular according to some polls, along with his party. What do you think that relationship between Trump and Trudeau is going to look like over the first few months of his presidency?
Well, Trudeau can't be happy. This obviously, what Trump is doing, obviously, even indirectly supports Pierre Poilievre, his conservative opponent. So, I mean, it gets into Canadian politics, and we know, what Trump says doesn't make it, directly into public policy. The United States is not going to invade Canada. But in pushing and showing sort of a weakness, Trudeau weakness on Canadian sovereignty, Trump further weakens Trudeau's electoral position. And it might be on purpose, because Poilievre probably sees more eye to eye with Trump on a lot of issues. It might not be on purpose, and he doesn't care. From Trudeau's point of view, it doesn't really matter which way it's coming from.
According to Semaphore, Kari Lake is in the running to be ambassador to Mexico. Kari Lake is a fierce ally of Trump. She backed strict limitations on immigration and called migrants entering the U.S. an invasion. If she does end up being the ambassador to Mexico, what do you think that would mean for the U.S.-Mexico relationship?
Well, she is a bomb thrower, and she really gets into these sort of conservative culture war issues. So on the bomb throwing side, I think the Mexicans can handle that. The ruling party is very much of the same kind of political bent as as Trump or as many other populist parties that have been winning around the world lately. So that's fine. The socially conservative side might short circuit for Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum, who is a populist, but she's very, very socially liberal. So that could make for a complicated relationship. It might be advantageous for Trump to have someone like that when he will have in Marco Rubio and probably incoming Deputy Secretary of State Chris Landau. He's going to have two very calm, sort of very traditional conservative Republicans leading U.S. diplomacy. So the Mexicans are happy about that. They know how to deal with those two, and sort of throwing a little bit of a spark into the relationship might work to Trump's advantage.
All right, we'll have to leave it at that, but I want to thank you, Rafael Bernal, Hill staff writer. Appreciate you coming on.
My pleasure.
Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson is set to debut on Broadway this weekend in a one-night-only performance of the Broadway musical comedy & Juliet. Justice Jackson has long expressed a desire to become the first black female Supreme Court justice to appear on a Broadway stage, even noting the goal in her Harvard College application. According to a report from Deadline, Jackson will appear in an ensemble role created specifically for her and sit down for a talkback with audience members following the show. President-elect Trump has tapped Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy to shrink the size of the federal government in his next administration. They say their work could include shrinking the size of the federal workforce. In today's Political Minute, Blake Berman, host of The Hill on News Nation, shows us how many civilians across the country work for the U.S. government today.
So just how big is the federal workforce? I'm Blake Berman, host of The Hill on News Nation. Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy will lead the Department of Government Efficiency in the next administration. Among the watchdog's main goals include cutting the size of the federal government and potentially the federal workforce, which is made up of all sorts of workers, including government officials, law enforcement agents, scientists, and more. In November, there were nearly 2.4 million civilian federal employees all across the country. About 85% of them work outside of the nation's capital. That does not include workers from independent agencies like the Postal Service. In fiscal year 2022, the federal government spent roughly $271 billion on compensation for these workers. Musk and Ramaswamy are pledging to trim that number in the next administration. I'm Blake Berman, and this is the News Nation Political Minute.
You can find more news and analysis from Blake and our colleagues 24/7 on News Nation. To find News Nation on your screen, go to joinnn.com. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.